second here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you here on a nice sunny Saturday. It's my pleasure this week to maybe reintroduce you to Dr. Mark Simone, who's back for a second session. He's the chair of the Department of Political Science and the coordinator of the Peace and Conflict Studies program at BGSU. He teaches courses on international relations, foreign policy, peace studies, and conflict resolution. He also runs the BGSU Model UN program. His research examines war and political violence, nonviolence, and conflict resolution. He's currently working on a project to evaluate the effect of climate change on terrorism and political violence, and I'm happy to have him here today.
Okay, hello, is the mic okay? Sounds fine. Now. Okay, that's good. I don't have to hurt my back leaning over. All right. Well, it's great to be out here again. Unfortunately, last time it was the first one. I don't know if anybody remembered that one. We were on Zoom. This is only a few weeks ago. It was like, what, 5-10 below zero? Love this climate. So I, Deborah and Danielle and others asked me to do one of these talks. They said, oh, we need some more, pick another. And I thought, oh, I'll do the high seas treaty. That could be interesting. Okay, I'm gonna really try to make it interesting, but it's not all that interesting. When you read, if you read through the book, it's a little dense and a little like, what is this all about? So I'll try to tell you a little bit about this treaty that was passed last June. It's a United Nations treaty. And I guess the big picture here is that we humans are finally getting governance around the planet. So this is like planetary management, which we're gonna probably have to do because it keeps getting warmer and the climate's getting weird. We may have to do things that affect the whole planet. And it turns out that before now, we've only really been worried about the land masses and the places that we live. We extended that out a little bit into the oceans before this last treaty. And now we're extending it out to most of the rest of the oceans. We do have some things out there. There's an outer space treaty and there's an Antarctic treaty and things like that. But there's places that don't have a lot of international governance yet. And this is one of the things that's happening here with the high seas treaty. So I just was looking for anything as a container ship. I'm hoping that we have some people here that have experience on the high seas. Personally, I don't. I've never been on a cruise. If we have any Navy veterans here, maybe that would be helpful. Or if you've been on a cruise, at least you've seen the high seas. Probably not a lot to see out there, right? We'll go to questions. I'd appreciate any comments and things, but yeah.
Does reading what we get count?
Yeah, it counts. There's no quizzes in this thing, so. Oh gosh, my computer's. This is so silly. All right, I have this up so I don't like stare backwards all the time. All right, so let's go to the first slide. Look at that. Comes up, yeah, it's gonna be a little small. So you may have heard of a concept back in, high school or something called freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas is something that's been around for a long, long time. Ever since, the Americas were discovered, there's been a lot of traveling over the seas. And one of the core issues for the United States from its founding was that in international politics, the US was all in favor of freedom of the seas. And this is the idea that any ship should be allowed free passage across international waters from one port to another, as long as they were a merchant or not an armed vessel threatening something, right? And the reason for that, of course, is if you think about the early United States, especially late 1700s, early 1800s, the US was a provider of a lot of goods to Europe, agriculture and otherwise, and wanted to make sure that they were able to trade with Europe, even if, as was often the case, Europe was at war. And okay. That was my alarm, that there's a war going on in Europe here. Yeah. Anyway, the idea was that principle should be upheld, and I'll give you a couple examples. And really, that concept of freedom of the seas was all we had until about 1982, when we had the first UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So here we go. So you again, maybe vaguely heard of the Barbary pirates. This is basically today's North African countries, and there were governments there that were sort of state supporters of piracy, attacking merchant ships during Jefferson's term. And he kind of went around Congress in a way to send some forces to fight the Barbary pirates and take them off so they would stop attacking our shipping, right? And again, you can think about this time period, early 1800s. This is Napoleonic Wars going on here. US is trying to get into the Mediterranean to trade with sides on, or countries on both sides of those wars, and some of those countries didn't like that, and so that's part of what happened. Things got worse later, and that was one of the causes of the War of 1812, was that the British were blockading neutral countries, and then finally not only stopping our merchant ships, but taking the sailors and impressing them, which I guess means forcing them to join the British Navy. And that was one of the causes of War of 1812. And the point here is that these things violate the freedom of the seas. So the US was like, no, we have this international principle, freedom of the seas, you can't do this. We need to fight. So back then, we had territorial water and international water. And generally, territorial water started out being about 3 miles, and it ended up being sort of a customary 12 miles from the shoreline. Why 12 miles from the shoreline? Because that's how far you could shoot to defend it from land. Okay? And so I've got an old Spanish cannon off the internet here. I thought that was kind of neat looking. I don't know if that could go 12 miles, suppose if it had a big enough charge. But that's the idea, is that you could treat the water within 12 miles of your shore as your sovereign land, just like it was land. You can do anything you want on it, shoot anybody, fish, do whatever you want. That's your sovereign territory. But right at 12 miles, there's a border, and then it becomes the high seas. And at that point, no country owns that land, that water, and the land underneath it, right? And we knew so little about the land. You're just mimicking, okay, I'm like, wow, she's like psychic. Because I'm doing the same thing.
Mark,
Yeah,
so would that apply to merchant marines, not armed ships, but ships carrying boots and butter to the Allies in World War II?
so this would be non-armed ships carrying supplies.
Right.
Yeah, it would, because they're not carrying armed goods, they're not supplying. I mean, this is the idea. If you're giving it or if you're selling it, that's commerce. As long as you're not shooting at anybody, you should have free passage in the open sea. Now, once you get inside that 12-mile border, somebody can shoot at you. But on the open seas, you're not supposed to be messing. That's why piracy is one of the biggest and earliest consensus international laws out there. So piracy is bad. And piracy on the high seas, essentially, right? Like, if I'm on your land, you can steal from me, but not in high seas, not in the open waters. And we have some other things I throw out here now. That these are laws, international laws that have universal jurisdiction. In other words, it's always a crime, and it doesn't matter where you commit it if you're on an international part of the world, which would be the high seas, right? So regulation of the seas, and there's different things about the seas. Again, I think there's some things that evolve. Those of you, if we have anybody who's serving in the Navy, right, but disabled vessels, there's not only, you should just let anybody go, but you're supposed to help out disabled vessels. They're supposed to be able to call for help. Any ship in the area is supposed to help out, kind of an obligation there. So it's an interesting environment for, legally, I suppose. Okay. So, yeah, all right. I'm gonna get into the law of the sea here a little bit in a sec, but I thought I really could talk about the Middle East, another hour or two, even though I did that a few weeks ago. But this is one of the things in the news related to the high seas and stuff like this. So you might have heard about shipping in Yemen, around Yemen, the Red Sea, and through the Suez Canal. And this is not really that big, but one point it makes is this Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal both have 22% of all global shipping going through it. Okay, so that's a really interesting or choke point place. You can see it a little better here. Whoop, I gotta go one more. Sorry. Where so right now what we have is in the north part of Yemen, where the red and green exploding things look like they're down there. There are a group of rebels called the Houthi rebels. They've been fighting a civil war really since about 2013 or so. They are Shia, not Sunni. They've been backed by Iran. They are really fighting for control of Yemen and the Yemen government. The Saudis and UAE have been attacking them for much of the last decade, but that was winding down until the recent attack of Hamas of Israel and the war that's been going on between Israel, Hamas, and Gaza. And so the Houthi rebels are one of several different Iranian-backed Shiite militia groups who have been launching attacks on US and Israeli targets and a few others, sort of in support of the Palestinian cause, right? So it's not really helping them out to attack shipping going through this choke point in the Red Sea, but it got the attention of the Americans and the British, and I guess a coalition of about 23 countries who are now supporting the US and British in attacking the Houthis down there in Yemen. And you can see, again, it's not just that the oil comes up this Bab el-Mandeb Strait and into the Red Sea, but it also comes out of the Strait of Hormuz underneath Iran and around, from Iraq and down. There's a lot of oil going there, not just other kinds of shipping. So, and shipping companies pay a lot of money for insurance. And when people start shooting rockets at your ships, the insurance rates go way up. Yeah. And so what happens is if you can see the little bluer one here on the other side, it has India kind of, your alternative route, if you don't go through the Suez Canal, is to go all stinking way around Africa. And I guess, at least by the estimate of this thing, it's a difference between a 25-day trip from India and a 34-day trip, about 9 days extra in the sea. And I don't know what the cost of that would be, but I figure at some point the insurance rates go up enough that you just take the extra 9 days, right? And that slows down shipping and increases costs and drives up inflation and all stuff that happens to the world economy. And so, again, and Joe Biden, I was looking for a quote, but wouldn't be surprised if he said, America needs to defend the freedom of the seas, just like in the 1800s, okay? So it's a principle and a lot of countries agree on it, even if they disagree ideologically, because everybody wants to get their goods to market. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I'll tell you a little bit about the United Nations Conference or Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So this is the first treaty that updated international law on the sea from that 12-mile territorial border rule plus freedom of the seas into a little bit of the modern era. And it wasn't passed until 1982, and it took about 25 years to get that passed. Okay, so this was done through the United Nations with the General Assembly voting and things like that. It only came into force after, I think, 60 countries ratified it, and so that wasn't even until 1994. Now we have about 168 countries that are party to the treaty. The United States did not sign it, but they do basically obey it and have been supportive of it because it made some really good rules that have helped create basically good fences, creating good neighbors. The idea was that a lot more was happening outside of 12 miles in 1982 than there was back in 1882. And so they needed to do something to regulate this. There's basically, they created this thing called the exclusive economic zone. And so what they said is now 200 nautical miles, and I'm not an expert, nautical miles are slightly different than regular miles, so it's a little longer than 200, but whatever. So 200 miles from shore, you get this other part of the sea that now you have exclusive economic rights to. And in certain cases, depending on the shape of the continental shelf, it can go out as far as 350 miles. But of course, that's hard to actually draw on a map. So let me go, first go to the next slide, and you can kind of see how this works. You know, this has sort of the 12-mile territorial water stuff, full sovereignty over the airspace and the seabed and everything around it, right? Then you got 200 nautical miles, and that's your exclusive economic zone. So what can you do there? You can fish, you can mine, oil, whatever, but you can't prohibit legal passage, even here, or loitering. I guess the ship could hang out. So the idea was it's no longer the high seas in terms of economics. So if you want to fish there, you want to mine the deep seabed, and deep seabed mining was a real thing coming in the 70s and 80s, then you should be able to keep those resources as part of your national wealth. And so you could, like ships could come in and hang out and pass and loiter, but if they wanted to fish, they would need your approval. And in many cases, countries worked together and created networks that regulated fishing in an area and stuff like that. So now we've taken the ocean that was only barely charted for national sovereignty and made it into a place where lots of countries had lots more territory than they did before. You go to the next one. So this is from your book, and I think it's a decent depiction because, so the dark blue is area that under the Law of the Sea Treaty 1982, now is part of national territory in a sense, right? At least economically. And so, you know, a country like the US and Canada, it's pretty easy. You just go out 200 miles and you draw lines. But, you know, this gets really tricky when you start looking over in Asia and all the Pacific islands and all, I mean, there's so many little islands and a lot of them are closer than 200 miles from each other. And so how do you draw those lines? Try to cut in the middle, what angle? There was a lot, this is why it took 25 years to negotiate this treaty, right? And there's still disputes. You hear about the South China Sea and things going on down there. I mean, this is another thing I got to see in Japan once, but they are able, the Chinese and the Japanese and others are able to dredge up land sometimes and create little islands. I saw this in Japan where they were trying to extend the American Air Force Base out there near Hiroshima, and you know, the people didn't want the noise and this and that. They said, okay, fine, we'll just dredge up stuff and build the runways out in the sea. And that's what they did, you know, still loud, but just amazing to me that we can do that. But you know, you pull up a new island and all of a sudden it is gonna affect the borders and who owns what. So there's still a lot of disputes about this, but the idea was, okay, So now we can really regulate this. And one of the areas that I'm kind of familiar with would be the Grand Banks up by Nova Scotia, northeast Canada. That's a really good fishing ground, apparently. And, so the Canadians got at control over that economic resource and try to work with the US and Denmark, which controls Greenland, and others to come up with some regulations about how that could be fished and things like this. But they kept having problems, even before the law of the sea in the 70s, I think. Maybe it was halibut. Anyway, they overfished one type of fish to the point, I think, of maybe a form of cod that, just got overfished to the point of the next season there were no fish to catch commercially, right? Turbot is another fish that these don't look pretty, whatever, tastes good. It's protein, it sells. So they fished the turbot really in the 80s to the point where it got nearly extinct. And why does that happen? Well, that's because of this thing called the tragedy of commons. And this is the idea that now, by the 80s in the turbot era, the regulations were pretty clear. But what was happening is the Spanish and Portuguese, no offense, apparently they have a bad reputation for coming and fishing in places that they're not supposed to. The other thing is that, of course, fishing technology's gotten so mechanized that with nets and drift nets and things that they can just take all of the fish out. These boats can catch so much more. So in the 80s, there was a big disputes about this because the Spanish trawlers and Portuguese and others would come in, and they actually had negotiated to get a right to catch some fish there, but they would always catch more than they were supposed to and then sneak back to Europe. And this is a problem, not just because the Canadians are losing money, but because you overfish and then now the fish don't come back. So this is the tragedy of commons, common pool resource problem. If there's an open place that anyone has access to and there's valuable things in it, everybody has incentive on their own to get as much fish as they can, right? Just like if there was a pond in Bowling Green that had lots of good fish, people would I'm gonna get as much fish because I get to eat all that fish for me, right? But if everybody does this, is what our parents told us, then the fish don't have enough to make baby fish, and all of a sudden, you don't have any more fish next year. So that's what happens in common pool resources. And the idea of the law of the sea treaty was, well, let's let the farmers or the countries build fences around their fishing grounds. 200 miles we thought would be enough. Most fish stay near the continental shelf because it's shallower and warmer waters. And so that would cover most of the fishing. Countries can regulate it themselves. If the Portuguese and the Spanish are being bad, like Canada did at this time, they actually shot warning shots. Didn't actually shoot the boats, but you could police your area with violence if you want, So we thought this would be a way to give the countries who have the fish the incentive to manage the fish properly so that we won't overfish and run out of fish. The oil part of this deep sea mining was more controversial. One of the reasons why the United States never ratified this treaty back in 1982 was that the second part of the treaty said, okay, if you take economic resources like deep sea mining out of the seabed, we want some of that to be shared with the rest of the world. And this comes from the idea of the high seas being the common heritage of, at that time, mankind. In the new treaty, it's the common heritage of humankind. So what they did was they said, okay, there'll be companies that want to go drill and mine, there's chemicals down there. These days, I think it's less about oil and gas, it's more about the strategic minerals we put in our phones and electronics and things, right? So we want to give companies an incentive, they'll have to get some profit out of this, but some of the profit will be taken and given to an authority that maybe helps manage the laws of the seas, and that can then give grants to other countries to help them get technology to do these things. In other words, kind of share it around a little bit. And back in the Reagan era, this sounded a little like communism, I think. It's so that the Reagan era people did not go for that part of the treaty, but they liked the 200-mile boundaries, made things a lot more clear, easier to regulate, prevented a lot of shooting and potential wars. So that's been pretty solid since then. All right, let me give you one of the problems though that came up with the UN law on the sea from the 80s. Back in the 80s, the Arctic was frozen over most of the time, and very little shipping could actually take place. But as you know, it's gotten a little warmer in the last 40 years. I should have put the ice retreat here, but it's getting so that in the summer you can pretty much ship through the Northwest Passage and over the North Pole, and certainly it has opened up areas that can be explored for gas and oil and a lot of them. So nobody bothered to really draw really good lines up in the Arctic back in the 1980s because it was all frozen. Nobody was going to use it anyway. Well, as the climate changed, things started to shift, and then the Russians, yeah, it's always the Russians, decided that they actually should control much more of the North Pole area than the Law of the Sea Treaty gave them control for. And there's Canada, the US, Denmark, which controls Greenland, and Norway, the 5 countries around there. And they all had their lines. Let's go to the next slide here, I'll show you. So let's see, the red lines were the Law of the Sea 200-mile lines that existed. And Russia's saying basically this brown ridge that extends, what they say, from their continental shelf all the way through the North Pole means that they should get all the shaded area there too. And there's concerns here about oil and gas exploration, although that's faded now and it's a lot more military. The Russians have a lot of icebreakers. We have like 2 in the US. And there was a fear about this area becoming more militarized and stuff. So that's been going on since about 2014, 2015 or so. They seem to have worked it out, so we're still kind of waiting on a final ruling about where that ridge is, where the line really should be, and who's going to get what. But because we have a Law of the Sea Treaty, we can actually work this out in international courts using rules and things like that, right? So that's one of the utilities of having some rules over places like this where we don't always know what's going to happen. Okay, now we'll get to my last slide. Well, yeah.
What is this disputed area number 4?
Okay, that's a separate dispute because there's some island, I think it's called Hans Island, and then there's Franz Josef Land is there, but right here. I believe that was from between Denmark and Sweden over who actually controls that. And that actually got settled. I can't remember who got that area. And the only reason that it matters really is the potential for gas drilling down there. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just sort of the notes on the High Seas Treaty that we're going to chat about here. And what the Law of the Sea Treaty gave us a 200-mile extension of the territorial waters with some rules. But it didn't create any organization really to deal with it too much. There's a fund where some of the seabed mining stuff is shared, but that didn't end up generating a whole lot of cash. But there's new things that are happening, right? And it's because I guess we just don't know a lot about the high seas area. Even now I saw one of the stats in your reading was, I think 80% of the deep seabed is not mapped to at least current mapping standards. I mean, it wasn't until the middle of last century that we even knew there was a big ridge in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that was the 2 continents, continental divide,
Yeah,
geologists in the house here, the continents pushing up at each other, there's this big ridge. We didn't understand plate tectonics and stuff because we didn't know what the seabed looked like. Now we do. And we know that there's a lot of stuff down there, potentially minerals and, there are already, people are talking about mining on the moon and asteroids. We still got, areas in the earth that we haven't dealt with, right? So the technology is advancing and allowing us to do more things in the deep sea. 39% of all fish stocks in the world are overfished. So does that say that the law of the sea treaty, the 200-mile rule, didn't work? Well, it worked some. It's better than it was. But the problem is the fish don't know about these borders. And they go and they might go 200, they're in the 200 miles and now they're out in the high seas. And then they go over to somebody else's 200 miles. And so if you're really good at fishing and you've got all the sonar in the nets, you can sit out in international waters and catch as much fish as you want as they move around outside the areas here. And it ends up with the same overfishing problems we were having before, right? So there was a sense that, the common areas needed some more regulation there. There's new things out there now that they call marine genetic resources. So marine genetic resources, that's incorrect, not like deep sea mining, but in a way. This is the fact that there are still zillions and zillions of species we haven't even identified in the ocean. And one of the things that we get from the natural world is new sources of medicine and food, but mostly, I think, medicine. It comes from living organisms, could be even bacteria, right? That make molecules that we find have the potential to help with things like cancer, right? Not an expert on this. I know of some plant-based things, the Pacific yew tree that generated a medicine that helps with ovarian cancer. What we do with these things is we gather the genetic material, we look at the molecules that they're able to produce. And now I think with the assistance of artificial intelligence, the process could go faster. We try to figure out if there's any good human uses for these things. If they are, people commercialize them and then they'll learn how to synthesize the molecules eventually without the marine life. But the point here is, if the high seas are just this open area nobody owns, then anybody can go out there and mine and get all the organisms they can and get wealthy off of this. And the rest of the world says, hey, wait a minute, I thought the high seas were the common heritage of humankind. So you can't patent the genetic material of some squid that you find, right? That should be all of us sharing that. And so the treaty evolved to deal with that part of it, saying, okay, let's come up with some rules. Like, we don't want people not to find the medical cures, right? We want that to happen. We want to give it the same thing with deep sea mining. We want to get some profit motive here. But at the same time, when you do make some profit, we want that to be shared with other countries, even landlocked countries, because it's all part of our human resource, right? And so that's what the High Seas Treaty is trying to set up now, is the financial mechanisms to do that sharing. They basically, the first thing they do is create a fund that profits go into, and it's a pretty low percentage, like 10% or something. But that's to generate enough money to actually enforce the High Seas Treaty and to give technology and help to other countries that might want it, that you apply for grants. So let's see, the other things that are happening in the ocean, well, marine protected areas, they call them. The idea is that there's quite a bit of life in the ocean that's not near the continental shelves, and that doing things like mining or searching around for genetic resources can do things that mess up that ecology and could affect the biodiversity of plant and animal life in the sea. Another thing you probably heard about, and I thought we could spend a long time in this, and I thought, we all know this, plastics from The Graduate, remember that? It's one of those one-liners from the movie. Yeah. So plastics, especially single-use plastics, have come under a lot of scrutiny. And I'm really glad to see most of you using styrofoam cups, which are only bad for the ozone layer. I'm kidding, I've got a plastic bottle in here too. Apparently they're everywhere. The plastic bottles and cups and straws and grocery bags and stuff. Even if, I mean, we might do really well and put them in the trash and it gets the landfill and they stay there. Around the world, this stuff just blows around, gets into the oceans. Also, ships can take the stuff out and dump it in the sea. Because, you know, that's another thing you can do when nobody owns the place is you can dump there, right? Again, I learned this when I was a teenager hanging around not really well-raised boys, I think. But yeah, you know, you dump things and then you get in trouble for it because you're not supposed to dump there. Well, in the high seas, nobody was ever preventing anybody from dumping it. And that's where I was gonna ask those who've been on cruises, where do they dump theirs? I mean, those are big boats, you know? And I've even been told that airlines, when you flush the toilet up there, where does that water go? It stays on the plane, yes. Okay, except for Alaska Air, then it goes out the side.
We were on a cruise one time, I looked back of the ship, I could see them throwing trash bags out the back.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow,
Trash bags through the sea. Trash bags.
wow, yeah, I mean, they're not supposed to do that, right?
Newer cruise ships have a program where you can tour the bowels.
Oh.
They recycle smashed compact
They compact the trash and recycle,
so that they can take it.
they take it to port and drop it off, yeah, I think that's, did you do the tour, you saw that?
No, so some people.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
No, I've never, been on the high seas, and to see some of this stuff happening, but I did used to work on the inland waterways in, United States. We'd be in the middle of the Mississippi River,
yeah,
it would be dark, and we'd dump stuff.
oh,
Same
I
way.
thought you were gonna say, and we saw these young boys coming out to dump.
No, but it was done at night.
Done at night in the middle of the Mississippi, I guess that's a pretty wide area.
So there's the mistake that this guy saw, was they did it during the day when they could see him.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I don't know, there's certain something about dumping. But you know, the idea is we want to try to reduce the amount of plastics in the environment. They seem to be collecting in the oceans at a much higher rate, but it's all over. I mean, and you're aware of this, right? That those plastics break down into nanoparticles. You can't hardly even see, you know, small little grains of sand. And they're getting into our bodies because we eat fish that have come, you know, the plastics get into their bodies. But apparently it's even happening with cows and, you know, land animals now, and that most people have a certain amount of microplastics in their bodies. We're not really sure that that's a good thing. In fact, in many cases, it's probably not.
Grandma called it roughage.
Roughage, I like that. Well, you know, I did used to eat dirt when I was a kid, I don't dare now. Anyway, what they're trying to do is bring the high seas into a regulatory environment where it is illegal to dump things, and that we can do things to regulate shipping so that now if somebody does throw trash bags off the back of the cruise ship, there could be some consequences for the cruise ship company because there's an international body that can bring those charges. So that when you don't commit a crime under anybody's jurisdiction, nobody can prosecute you, right? So now we've got hopefully an international regulatory system run by the 193 countries in the UN to deal with them and stuff. And that's what the last point down here says, the conference of parties meetings. So the current high seas treaty, which again passed last June, has set up sort of a regular meeting thing. You might have heard of this term conference of parties or COP meetings because they're the climate change conventions also have had those since the early 90s. And what they're doing here is basically getting, it's not a permanent organized thing, but every year they're gonna meet, they're gonna handle, like make rules about what's been happening last year. They're still refining the initial treaty to figure out how the costs are gonna be shared and benefits of the genetic resources and mining and stuff like that. But there's actually a sort of an organization that can handle some of this stuff. And they could create or delegate their authority to regional organizations and say, okay, so people are caught dumping and doing something wrong in the Indian Ocean. We got, the South Asian coalition of countries that's gonna handle that. Okay, but the idea is somebody is gonna care or someone will have jurisdiction. And that's what they want to do. Let's see. So the plastics problem is tough because it's not just a lot of that stuff blows into the sea. It's not just dumped, but the vast amount of shipping traffic that's out there, I guess there's just problems that are created. The other thing that they really wanted to do in this high seas treaty is to make companies, especially, but a country behind them, do environmental impact assessments when they're going to be doing new projects. So if you're going to do some mining out in the deep seabed, first you need to check out, and again, I don't know if you're familiar with this idea, but get teams of scientists out there to say, hey, maybe if you do the drilling right here, that would really be bad because it's a major whale crossing. There's going to be problems with these whales. Or this is near a really important deep vent in the ocean that creates hot air, and there's all this really funky life down there. So could you do it, down the road? Again, just basic rules like how are we going to be good stewards to the earth and take care of things rather than just let people dump where they please, mine where they please, and not have any consequences. So that's the goal. But these things, the thing about the high seas treaty is that it actually compared to the other one, the UNCLOS treaty got done pretty quickly. I guess I have one more concluding slide, and that'll be something like that. And I would say this, that what I take away from the high seas treaty so far is that the United Nations system is still functional. It surprisingly is still working on these kinds of issues. You can still get, 100 well, not all 193 countries are going to ratify this, but probably 160 to 170 countries to agree on sets of rules to manage the high seas. That's a pretty big achievement given how much diversity of interests and wealth and everything else we have on this planet. So, that part of our system is still going strong. And it's important because, to manage the climate, and the oceans play a huge role in that. Probably, I don't know, upwards of 60–70% of the CO2 that gets stored out of the atmosphere goes into the oceans and the ocean circulation systems. And that CO2 getting sucked out of the atmosphere is keeping us from being even warmer than it is now, right? And it's part of the solution. If we mess up those ocean currents, that could have big problems. And if we have no way to coordinate like how each country is going to behave, that could be a problem. So I'm going to expand on this because we have a little time. The movie Finding Nemo?
Yeah.
You probably, if you have grandkids, and may have seen that 30 or 40 times. I don't know.
Yes.
There's a lot of little fish, and Nemo's lost. He gets found. It's a really powerful story. But there's a point there when Nemo's going, and they jump into this thing called the East Australian Current, I think, and it's like this massive river that's under the sea, and they're swimming along, and then they jump into that fast-moving current, and whoosh, they're off to Australia or wherever. We have those underwater river systems all through the oceans. And one of of the major ones is actually, we think of the Gulf Stream that kind of goes up across the North Atlantic and keeps Europe warmer than Canada is, for instance, because there's southerly flow up there, the warm water goes up, and then it gets really salty and sinks right near Greenland. And that sinking action takes zillions and bazillions of tons of water down to the bottom of the ocean with all kinds of carbon dioxide that's dissolved into the water, right? And that circulates back around, and this is how the oceans absorb a lot of carbon. Well, there's quite a big fear that as the Greenland ice and Arctic ice, especially the Greenland ice, melts, that, and this has happened in, thousands of years ago in planetary records that we see in geology, that the fresh water melting off of Greenland will come in and dilute the water in the North Atlantic, and that will keep it from being too salty, and it will keep it from sinking, which will keep that whole system from moving, and all of a sudden that Gulf Stream will slow down and stop. And when that happens, we actually get massive cooling in Europe. It will be like Canada, right? But it also stops taking the CO2 down, which means there's a lot more CO2 back up in the air, which means the planet warms faster. And there's just stuff like that going on, and the oceans are part of the planet. And if we don't have some way to cooperate to deal with this, it could be every country for themselves. And there's actually cool stuff happening on that front. See, I know more about climate change than I do about international law of the high seas. But there's all kinds of efforts to sort of shore up the glaciers on Greenland and figure out ways to kind of protect them, because what's happening is, I guess, the warmer seawater is hitting against the ice on the land and undermining it. And then at some point, you get water underneath and it slides back into the ocean. And that's, if it's just ocean water that's frozen, that's just like an ice cube melting in your glass. It's not gonna really affect the sea levels of the problem. But if it's the ice on land that slides into the ocean, then the sea level rises and all these things. So they're developing, these weird technologies and netting and other things to try to protect the edges of these glaciers and keep them from melting and stuff. So, and the problem is there's no money in it, right? Because who are they protecting? Well, they're protecting all of us. Well, who's going to pay for that? Well, Iceland might pay a little, I don't know, but it's hard to finance. And so they've been trying to get insurance companies who insure coastal areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise to pay for that. But eventually we're going to have to kind of chip in together. And, there's other talk about, again, I'm not advocating these things, it's in the air about maybe doing something to cool the planet by sending up. I mean, you could think about it like a big space umbrella to kind of shield the sun a little bit and dim the sun that way. There's lots of ways to do it. You could do it with just sulfuric acid, putting it in the jet fuel and letting that stay in the stratosphere that will reflect sunlight. But we have to do that kind of thing together, because we can't just let one country decide, okay, it's too hot where we are, so we're going to send up a whole bunch of stuff into space and dim the sun. If it affects you, too bad. So this is what international law is all about. And it's to find ways that independent sovereign countries can cooperate on a voluntary basis, because it is all voluntary. But if we can come up with rules, and the rules make sense to most of the countries and are willing to obey them, we could get a lot done and avert some bad things. So I'll stop there. Maybe we can talk about some sea stories. And thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, there's one back here. Let her go back.
In December, the United States extended extended continental shelf limits to include an area of
I'll repeat. You said in December, the US
6 weeks ago.
extended the continental shelf, like, where?
Well, mostly the Arctic.
Okay, yeah, that was the Russian dispute I'm talking
But they have now, the United States has extended it, has announced it, and it's worse.
So that's a good point. I assume that's based on teams of geologists deciding now that, well, we were wrong before, the continental shelf extends much further than we thought. We sent some divers up there. I'll check it out. I hadn't heard that.
Other countries also extended their, continental shelf.
Yeah. And that's because when they made the rules in 1982, we don't have the mapping, we didn't really know. And so now countries are like, well, hey, if I can extend the shelf out, now I can go 350 miles instead of 200. And so that gets me more oil and gas, right? Thanks for the info. That was December. I'll check it out. Yeah.
In 1982, you said that the Reagan administration thought that UNCLOS sounded too much like communism.
Well, just the part about sharing the wealth
Sharing the
on
wealth,
the
yeah.
deep sea mining. Yeah.
When it was finally ratified in 1994, that was well into the Bill Clinton administration.
Good point.
And there have been one or two administrations since then. Why are we still not?
So why is the United States still not ratifying the 1982 treaty?
Yeah,
So we have a problem in the Senate in the US. You have to to ratify a treaty, you gotta have 2/3 of the Senate. That's 67 votes. And, we've been close, I mean, I think there've been, sometimes it's Democratic majority, sometimes Republican, but it's never been more than about 55 to 58 in the last couple of decades, right? Getting to 67 has been really hard. And so the United States has really stopped ratifying treaties in the last 20 years or so. It's not for lack of trying. I mean, there's things like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's stuff that really looks, US, Iran, and North Korea are the three who have ratified. But it's because sometimes it comes in one or two senators decide, no, I don't like this provision here because, again, rights of the child, that has some, what was the complaint? You'd think it was abortion, but no, it was, I think it was defining child soldiers and the age of consent to join the military as 18. And, we have 17-year-olds who can sign up through high school, and I don't know. There's little stuff like that. And, it just seems like presidents have decided in most cases, well, as long as we obey it and it becomes expected that we'll obey it, and, why do I want to go through the Senate and lose? And so they'll just make an executive agreement that commits the US to abide by the treaty, which the next president can just tear up. But if it goes a couple of administrations, the rest of the world's like, okay, the Americans are gonna do this, it's okay. But yeah, that's it, it's our political system, we just don't have, I'm not saying we should allow a treaty to be ratified with fewer than 67 senators, but it's just been hard to get that.
okay.
Great question. Yeah.
I'm looking at this chapter, and my mind flashed back to, Alaska, and the Valdez.
Oh, yes, the Valdez, the oil spill.
So the question is, how can we monitor, have safe conditions?
So the Exxon Valdez, that was a ship that burst or whatever, and, it was an accident. They didn't do it on purpose. But it did cause all kinds of damage to not just the US, but other countries, coastlines and the sea itself. So that's part of an environmental, impact statement or an assessment, right? Is if we're going to be building new oil pipelines or moving shipping routes, what will happen when there's a big oil spill, right? And the thing that people are worried about now is less, I think the ships have, after the Valdez and others, shipping has gotten better, double hulls and things to try to avoid those sort of accidents. But we always have the problem of terrorism and military attacks on pipelines that are very vulnerable. I don't know, there was one in the Baltic, related to Russia and Ukraine, somebody attacked, I think it was a gas pipeline in the Baltics. Sweden was investigating this, and then just last week decided we can't figure it out, we don't know where we're stopping. So they're not really, sort of, everyone of course suspects the Russians, but it's clear that it was blown up. It's not clear who did it. And so again, you know, it's like when we have a pipeline over land, we have to think, well, there's a small chance that there'll be a big leak, and what would that, how much harm would that cause? And is there a place we could move the pipeline that would cause less, you know? Yes.
Based on your talk, I could ask you about a dozen questions.
Oh, good.
I'm just gonna ask you two. The first one is, you mentioned the fact that, just briefly, about airspace somehow being tied to the territorial water.
Right, you have, yeah,
Now, it turns out that if you're going to have wind power, or the wind blowers with big turbines,
right.
the wind is the best just offshore, anywhere you go. The reason for that is that the water in the seas, temperature doesn't change very much.
Mhm.
On land, sun comes out, the land temperature goes way up, then during the day, and it goes down at night, and these temperature differentials cause winds to flow between the land and the sea area.
So the shore breeze, right?
Sure, yeah. So the best place to put windmills is just offshore. So now the question becomes, how far can you go offshore and you still own the rights to the wind that's gonna make the wind power?
Well,
And well,
the answer would be 200 miles under current, but no, you don't need to go out that far. is what you're saying.
there are places that you can go out further.
Mhm.
The best example is the North Sea, where the wind is very constant, very high
Mhm.
across that whole area most of the time. Now, Norway and England get along fine, so that's not gonna be an issue. But it may be an issue somewhere else.
Mhm.
So, and my first question is, then how do you coordinate the airspace more with the coastal waters thing? Because if you get out too far, somebody's gonna come along and do just what you mentioned earlier. Hey, that wind you're using more than your share of the wind, that wind belongs to us, you gotta do something with that.
Right, right.
So that's my first question. Second question.
Wait, can you answer that?
Since we have people online, can I answer that one first? I'll repeat.
Yeah.
So this is a question about windmills, and that generally they will be located close to shore because of the shore breeze and differential between the land temperature and the ocean temperature. But in some places, there's good breezes a little far offshore. And if the countries don't get along, how will they know who owns the wind? And that's a perfect reason why we might want to go beyond the law of the sea treaty, because that 200-mile border, especially if you've got countries close together, it's not going to be 200 miles, right? Like, let's just say it was the English Channel, it's 20 miles, right? France has half of that, England has half, right? But if you wanted to put windmills out there, well, there'd be a border, and you could argue about it. But then if you're going, like you said, in the North Sea, you could be in an area where one country is putting a bunch of windmills, and these would have to be somehow attached to the seabed, right? You can't just float them. So it wouldn't just be airspace, but you're right, it's like they're stealing our wind. Like if they had really massive numbers of them, there was less wind after. So I can't think of an example of that happening yet, but I think it's in the future. I think so. So is that okay? Can we go on to the next one? Next question?
Yeah, my next question is, and you touched on this briefly too, but in a way that didn't really bring up the problem. You mentioned that, the US somewhere in Japan, wanted to have an airport, or a place to land airplanes.
Yeah.
So they built this little island, land airplane, away from the mainland. Well, now, a lot of countries countries, specifically China and Russia, have figured out how to really make some hay with this concept. And the Chinese are building islands way off of the mainland China to extend their territorial water.
Exactly, that's exactly, yeah.
And the reason being, they don't want anybody else's ships going in that area. Now,
Well, there's other reasons too. You're right. China is building islands that extend its territorial waters because then they say, here's this island, we just built it, but it's part of China. Now we get 200 miles from that island,
right,
right?
now, the Russians, they're doing it in a little different way. The Russians have figured out, as you mentioned in your presentation, that the Northwest Passage is going to be a place we can run shipping, very soon, if not now already. So they're building islands so that they can basically claim that, oh, the best route to get to the Northwest Passage is in our territory, all within our territory. We built these islands. So when are the US and Canada going to get smart and go to be able to guarantee their own passageway through the Northwest Passage?
Okay, so the US and Canada could get together and build islands to make, I guess, extend the claims of their territorial waters that might help shipping or maybe mining interests, I suppose. Canada's got better technology for that than we do, but as I mentioned, the US just doesn't have a lot of icebreakers, and we kind of put some in the budget, but it's gonna be another 10 years before we get enough technology. And I don't think the US has the technology to build islands up there right now. Maybe with Canadians and Norwegians and the Danes. And the other thing is, all 4 of the 5 countries are allies in that Arctic area. Russia's the odd one out, right? So Russia's doing these things unilaterally, expecting the others not to cooperate. And I think the US has taken this stance that, well, this is going to be a slow moving thing. We don't have a lot of technology to fight it that way right now, so we'll just keep pressure and negotiating. And I honestly don't know which Northwest Passage is going to be the best one. It may be that Russia's is already that good anyway. They're just building islands to keep it that way and create tolls and things so they can get money out of the shipping.
Well, that's the whole point, that if they have the North Passageway, then they're going to charge a toll.
Yeah.
Like Suez Canal charges a toll.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I didn't put it up, but I was looking at that shipping thing. The Panama Canal apparently is dry, only like 1 or 2% of world shipping going through there. I guess because it's not big enough anymore, is what I hear.
It said 1.2% on your.
Yeah, I thought that was really low. Has anybody ever been through the Panama Canal on cruise or something? Did you see other regular ships or just cruise?
Yeah, but they were expanding it then.
Oh, they were expanding, okay.
Yeah, but that was 14 years ago.
Well,
Yeah, 1.2 it says.
oh, yeah, I just pulled that from the internet, I can't vouch for the source yet, but, yeah, it's surprising. Question in the back.
No, on Panama, there are problems with enough water to ship very many.
So it's not deep enough?
Well, no, it's based on fresh water from the Gatun Lake or whatever, and that they're not getting the water that they used to get.
Oh, so with less rain, less water, oh my,
That's one of the small reasons that,
yeah.
that
Paul, I bet you know this because a lot of farm crews go through there.
But the issue with the Panama Canal, as he said, they've had severe drought, so the lake is not supplying the water that they normally need.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing about shipping in the Panama Canal is it's one way in the morning, the other direction in the afternoon.
Oh my.
Yeah.
It's like,
So you're not gonna see ships passing,
because it's that narrow.
yeah, because,
Oh, yeah.
because the locks are so narrow, there are 3 locks now on each side.
Wow. I gotta get on a cruise sometime to see this.
It's one ship wide.
One ship wide.
Yeah.
I wonder someday it'd be funny if they ever go back to Nicaragua and try to, there was a movement at various points in history to put another canal through there. Because there's like Lake Managua and I don't know, it's long, it'd be longer, but well, I guess if Panama Canal's not getting that much business now, maybe there's no incentive. Yes,
Yes, I was wondering, on the radio, I heard the other day that an awful lot of the economic, stuff going through the Red Sea there
mhm.
is basically of Chinese.
Yes,
And
China is bigger, my graphic had India there, but yeah, it's China getting access to the European market.
And China's not doing a damn thing concerning trying to protect.
They aren't,
it.
and the Iranians told the Houthis there are some Chinese vessels that have gone through and they haven't been shot at.
Really?
Yeah, they're trying to shoot at, European or American ones. The idea is that, the country supporting Israel. They want to attack, and it's not like they're getting anything out of this other than status of we're supporting the Palestinian cause, which is silly, but. Anyway, it's been bombed pretty extensively now, the Houthis, but the problem is they have been there a long time, they've got rockets, they can put them underground, and, gosh, with drones now, I mean, I get kind of worried, I know like regular people can buy drones, and, I keep waiting for like teenagers of my ilk to strap weird improvised explosive devices on them and go blow up the school or something. And I really shouldn't say these sort of things, right? I'm sorry. I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but the access to the technology now is just amazing. And this shipping in the Red Sea is one of the things, for very low cost, the Houthis are able to impose a pretty big economic cost on the rest of the world. Hopefully it will stop soon, but yeah. Wow. Well, this went way better than I had hoped. I was like thinking, man, the high seas, international law. But you guys have great questions, and it's still a beautiful day. I'm gonna go ahead and close now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very
And
much.